There is a particular silence that lives inside a stealth hull when everything is running dark, and I don't mean the ordinary quiet of deep space. I mean a chosen silence, engineered, deliberate, maintained through collective discipline across 41 crew members who have each decided, every hour for 6 days, to keep their mouths shut and their fingers still, and their consoles dimmed to the absolute minimum their duties require. I had been on 3 prior deep penetration runs in my career, and I had never fully gotten used to that silence. It wasn't peaceful, it pressed on you. It had weight and temperature, like standing in a room where everyone knows something you don't, except in this case everyone knows exactly the same thing, and the thing they know is that a single misaligned antenna array, a single reactor cooling vent opened 2 seconds too long, a single burst of residual electromagnetic noise from a jury-rigged relay junction could end the mission and end them. 6 days inside Varath sovereign space. I want you to hold that number for a moment before I go further, because it is the whole story in miniature. 6 days, not 6 hours on a border crossing, not 6 minutes in a marginal transit corridor where the treaty language is ambiguous and both sides have lawyers arguing about definitions. 6 days, running on minimum power, traveling at 1/16 of our capable speed, threading through the Varath Dominion's most heavily monitored interior space. The Keth Passage, which the Varath called the Sealed Corridor, which their doctrine stated was monitored to a resolution of 100 meters at all times by a latticed sensor grid stretching from the Varath border station at Varak Prime to the Deep System Relay Hub at Station Keth 9. The doctrine was wrong. I knew it was wrong before we went in, because it was my job to know. My name is Rael Duve. My rank at the time was Strategic Intelligence Analyst, 3rd level designation, which in practical terms meant that I was the person who read everything the Terran Survey Directorate had accumulated about the Varath Dominion sensor infrastructure over the preceding 11 years, and produced a document concluding that their border was not what they claimed it to be. That document ran to 412 pages. The summary on page 1 said, "The Varath Sealed Corridor contains a minimum of 7 sensor grid gaps, each between 40 and 200 kilometers wide, produced by a combination of stellar interference from the twin star pair at the Keth System's center, and the residual gravitational distortion of a collapsed relay station. The Varath lost to a microdebris impact in the 3rd year of their current border protocol. The Varath have patched these gaps with patrol schedules rather than hardware, and those patrol schedules can be read and predicted with 92% confidence from their own border traffic broadcasts." The document sat on a desk at the Survey Directorate for 8 months before anyone decided to do something with it. The person who decided was Captain Senna Vor. I had never worked with Vor before the * Crooked Silence assignment, and my first impression of her was wrong. She was not a large woman. She was not loud. She didn't walk into the briefing room with the kind of deliberate theatrical weight that some senior captains cultivate to compensate for the fact that they haven't been in a real operational situation in a decade. She walked in carrying a data tablet and a mug of something that smelled like reconstituted grain coffee, sat down at the head of the table, put the tablet face down and said, "Tell me what's wrong with the plan." Not what the plan was, not what I thought we'd find, what was wrong with it. I told her there were 3 things I was not certain about. The sensor gap data was 11 months old. The patrol schedules I'd extracted were derived from intercepted border traffic that had since gone to an upgraded encryption protocol, which meant my schedule predictions were based on a behavioral model rather than direct observation, and carried a confidence interval I was less comfortable with than the document's language suggested. And third, I didn't know what the Varath would do if we lit up inside their space. My document had said a great deal about their sensor grid. It said less about their command doctrine. Vor looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Those are honest concerns. I read your document twice. Here's what I think. The gaps are probably still there because the Varath infrastructure repair cycle for a dead relay station runs between 18 and 24 months, and they're 11 months in. The patrol schedule model is sound enough. And as for what they do, that's what we're going in to find out. The entire point of the mission is the answer to your third uncertainty. She picked up the tablet. Your job on this run is not to predict what happens when we surface. It's to watch what happens with every piece of equipment you have and record it without interpretation. The interpretation comes after. Understood? I said I understood. The *In's crooked silence was an asymmetric hull, one of a class of 6 that the Terran Admiralty referred to in public documents as long-range survey vessels, and in classified documents as deep-penetration stealth cruisers. She was not a beautiful ship, not in the way the fleet's flagships were beautiful. She had no clean lines, no visual grammar of deliberate design. She looked, from the outside, like something assembled from components that hadn't quite agreed to work together. Her forward hull a flat-nosed wedge that angled sharply to port. Her sensor array asymmetrically placed to reduce her cross-section on approach vectors. Her engine nacelles recessed, inside structural fairings that broke her thermal signature into diffuse bloom rather than the clean hot point of a standard drive. She was, in the language of the engineers who built her, optimized for ambiguity. She was designed to not look like anything identifiable at long range, and at short range, by the time she looked like anything at all, it would be too late for the information to be useful. I boarded her at Outer Reach Station, 12 days before the mission insertion window. I had a cabin roughly the size of a deep-sea pressure vessel, a data terminal with full access to the Directorate's files on the Varath Dominion, and a sensor suite console in the ship's secondary operations center that had been configured specifically for my use. The suite was not the ship's primary combat sensor array, that was the XO's domain, but it was a full passive intercept rig capable of pulling signals at a range and resolution that would have been classified 2 generations ago. My job was to sit at that console and listen. I was good at listening. The first 3 days of the transit to the insertion point were unremarkable. The crew of the *Crooked Silence was a specific kind of professional, not the loud bonding through shared hardship type you read about in old warship fiction. Not the stoic to the point of robotics type that made for good drama but poor actual colleagues. They were quiet, competent, and they had clearly done this kind of work before, because they didn't talk about it. The engineering deck ran their diagnostics on a cycle, so precise I started setting my biological clock by the faint vibration sequence that accompanied each completed check. The 2 signals operators who shared my secondary ops center, a specialist Tomas Urhiel and a senior operator Kyrie Vanson, worked with the economical focus of people who understood that the quality of what they captured would be argued over by analysts for the next 2 years, and they weren't going to give those analysts anything to complain about. I liked them for that. Urhiel was a younger man, long-limbed and prone to stillness, who had the habit of holding a stylus in his left hand without ever using it to write anything. He'd just hold it loosely and turn it between his fingers while he worked, and after the first day I stopped noticing it. Vanson was older, maybe 5 years my senior, with the particular look of someone who has spent a great deal of their professional life in small rooms with high-stakes equipment, calm to the point of apparent indifference, but with an attention to the console in front of her that never actually lapsed. She had been on 2 prior depenetration runs with Vor, and she told me once, during a rest period on the 3rd day, that the secret to this kind of work was to stop thinking about what you were doing in terms of the mission and start thinking about it in terms of the next 4 hours. Break it into 4-hour windows. Don't ask what happens when you surface. Ask what the passive intercept is telling you in the next 4 hours, and do that job well, and then do the next 4 hours. I thought about what Vor had said to me at the briefing, and I wondered if they had planned the conversation between them, but I decided it didn't matter. The advice was sound either way. On day 4, we crossed what the Varath called the threshold, the formal edge of their sovereign space, marked in their border traffic broadcasts as a navigational exclusion boundary and marked in their command doctrine, I knew from my research, as something considerably more emphatic. The Varath Dominion was a caste-based civilization, and the concept of sovereign space was not, for them, merely a political or legal abstraction. It was structural. Their caste hierarchy, and I will explain this briefly because it matters to what happened later, was built around the concept of controlled access. The highest caste, the Varath Kethali, held authority over all decisions above a certain complexity threshold. The second caste, the Varath Sedhari, administered the hierarchy's instructions. The third and fourth castes handled enforcement and labor respectively. The entire system was predicated on the idea that the hierarchy controlled what moved and what didn't move within the Dominion space, and the most fundamental expression of that control was the border. The border was not just a line. It was a statement about what the Kethali were. It said, "We determine who enters, we determine who crosses, we decide what comes through and on what terms." The border's inviolability was not a military claim or not primarily a military claim. It was a claim about the nature of authority itself. The Varath Sealed Corridor, specifically, was the Dominion's oldest and most trafficked internal transit route, stretching across 11 light-years of claimed space, and the Kethali had been broadcasting its sealed status to the galactic community for 60 years. It was the clearest expression of what they were. I had read 630 pages of Varath internal doctrine before boarding the *Crooked Silence*. I was not an enemy of the Varath, and the mission was not an act of war. But I understood, with the specific cold clarity that comes from having read something very carefully, that what we were about to do to their doctrine was not a small thing. We crossed the threshold at minimum power, running on passive systems only, slipping through the first identified sensor gap at the point I had calculated as the weakest node in the lattice. I watched my console. There was no spike in the Varath patrol frequencies, no change in the border station's transmission cadence. The gap was exactly where I had said it would be. Vanson made a very small sound, not a word, not quite an exhalation, something between them, and went back to her console. Urhil kept turning his stylus. We were inside. I have tried in the years since to describe what the next 6 days were like to people who haven't done this kind of work, and I've largely failed. The difficulty is that the experience was almost entirely composed of nothing happening. That sounds like it should be easy to describe, but it isn't, because the quality of the nothing was very specific. Every hour that passed without a Varath patrol changing course, without a spike in their active sensor sweep frequencies, without a change in the border station's traffic cadence, was an hour in which the document I had written was being validated in real time, and the validation was accumulating like interest. By the end of day 1 inside the threshold, I had roughly 24 data points confirming that my sensor gap analysis was correct. By the end of day 2, I had 48. By the end of day 3, with no indication that any Varath sensor system had registered our presence, I had begun to understand something that the dry technical language of the document had not quite captured. The Varath believed in their border absolutely, not as a claim they were prepared to defend, as a fact they had long since stopped questioning. Their patrol vessels moved with the unhurried precision of systems performing maintenance rather than surveillance. I pulled their internal comm traffic on the passive intercept. Urhil could have done this without my asking, but I asked anyway because I wanted to hear what they sounded like inside their own space, and what I heard was routine. Patrol cycle confirmations, crew rotation requests, a minor maintenance flag on a relay node at Keth 7 that had been in the queue for 19 days without action. The traffic had the quality of bureaucracy in a secure institution, thorough, procedural, and entirely untroubled. These were not people watching for something. They were people recording that they had watched and found nothing, because finding nothing was the expected and confirmed outcome, and had been for 60 years. I sat with that for a long time. There was something else in the traffic that I noted but did not include in my initial summary report, because it seemed tangential at the time and only became significant later. The Varath patrol vessels broadcast short confirmation pulses on a specific frequency every 40 minutes, brief, low-power, essentially digital signatures that said, "I am here. I have swept my assigned sector. I have found nothing." The border station at Varath Prime collected these pulses and logged them in a running record that I could see accumulating in real time. Hundreds of confirmations per standard day. Each one a small stone added to a wall that said, "Nothing is here. Nothing has been here. Nothing has ever been here." The wall was, by the time we crossed the threshold, approximately 60 years tall. Hundreds of thousands of confirmation pulses, logged and archived, constituting a record of inviolability that no one in the Dominion had any reason to question. I was watching new stones being added to that wall, while sitting 14 light minutes inside the territory it was supposed to be protecting. That was the thing I found hardest to write about in the formal debrief. Not the sensor gaps, not the patrol schedules, not the command hierarchy's response protocols. The confirmations. The fact that their own people were, in good faith, logging the absence of something that was present, adding to a record of security that was, in that specific moment, not a record of anything except the limits of their instrumentation. The sensors were doing what the sensors were capable of doing. The crews were doing what they were trained to do. The doctrine was being followed with complete fidelity by every person responsible for following it. And it was all producing a perfectly accurate record of something that wasn't true. On day 4, we passed within 43 kilometers of a Varath patrol vessel running its standard sweep arc. 43 kilometers. In open space that is nothing, deep space has a very different sense of distance than surface environments, and a combat encounter can open at ranges measured in light seconds. But for a passive running stealth ship trying not to be seen, 43 kilometers from an active sensor array is close enough to be careful about. We didn't need to be more careful than we already were, because we had already been as careful as it was possible to be. But the fact remained that a Varath patrol crew went about their confirmed nothing duty cycle 43 kilometers from a Terran warship they couldn't see. And the warship watched them and said nothing. And they passed. And they filed their confirmation traffic. And their network accepted the confirmation. And the doctrine rolled forward one more hour, untouched. I wrote a note in my log at the end of day 4. I wrote, "The border is not a sensor grid. The sensor grid has gaps and we are through the gaps, and the gaps are not the point. The border is a belief. It exists because the Varath have decided that it exists, and because no one has ever handed them evidence that it doesn't, and because the belief is 60 years old and has the weight of everything they built on top of it. When we surface, we will not be giving them a military problem. We will be giving them an epistemic one." I read that note back to myself, decided it was accurate, and went asleep for 5 hours. Day 5 passed without incident, but not without interest. On the morning of day 5, I captured an exchange between 2 Varath enforcement caste officers aboard the patrol vessel that had passed us on day 4, a routine shift change discussion that began with a handover of duty assignments and ended briefly, with one officer mentioning that they had submitted a maintenance request for a sensor calibration check. The sensor had been showing intermittent noise returns for the past 2 days. The receiving officer said, "Log it and I'll push it to the maintenance queue." The first officer said, "I already did 4 days ago." The sensor had been showing noise returns for 4 days. I ran a check on the noise return timestamps the officer had mentioned and matched them against the crooked silence *S track history. The noise returns corresponded, within my expected margin of sensor bleed error, to the periods when we had been closest to that vessel's sweep arc. Our stealth systems were not perfect. They were very good enough that the returns registered as noise rather than a contact, but a properly calibrated sensor array, with a skilled operator running deliberate analysis rather than routine sweep confirmation, might have flagged those returns for investigation. The request had been sitting in the maintenance queue for 4 days. No one had prioritized it. No one had looked at the noise returns analytically. Because nothing was supposed to be there. And when your doctrine tells you with 60 years of confirmed certainty that nothing is ever there, a noise return is a calibration problem, not a contact. I flagged that in my log with 3 stars and the note, "This is not a sensor grid problem. This is a doctrine problem. The instrument was telling the truth. The doctrine told them how to hear it." Day 6 passed the same way, quieter than day 5, and I spent much of it reading back through the previous 90-odd hours of intercept logs with the specific attention of someone looking for patterns that their real-time monitoring had not caught. I found 3 additional instances of patrol crews logging anomalous returns as instrument noise. Each instance corresponded to a period when we had been in range. Each request sat in a maintenance queue. None had been acted on. I added them to my summary file and noted the dates and times. It was not, I want to be clear, that the Varath were negligent. Their crews were doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Their maintenance queue system was functioning as designed. Their escalation protocols for sensor faults were working correctly. The problem was not any individual failure. The problem was systemic, and it was invisible from inside the system, because the system's fundamental assumption, the border is sealed, therefore anomalous returns are instrument error, was so deeply embedded in the doctrine that questioning it would have required a level of institutional self-skepticism that the Varath hierarchy was, structurally, not built to generate. You cannot be skeptical of your own foundation while you are standing on it. On the morning of day 7, or what I was calling morning, because the crooked silence kept a standard 24-hour cycle as a matter of crew health, I received a message from Captain Vore telling me to report to the Primary Operations Center at 600. I had been in the Primary Ops Center once before, during the initial transit, for a crew orientation that Vore had run with the same direct brevity she brought to everything. The center was a tight space. The Crooked Silence was not a large ship, and every compartment on her was exactly as big as it needed to be and no larger, with a central holographic display showing the navigation plot and the passive sensor picture, ringed by the consoles of the XO, the navigator, the weapons officer, and the signals chief. The XO was a man named Dorian Petch, quiet and broad-shouldered, who had a habit of resting his right hand on the edge of his console without gripping it, as if maintaining light contact with the ship through the metal. The weapons officer, Senior Lieutenant Annie Breck, was young for her rank, dark-eyed, and had the particular stillness of someone who is comfortable with the idea that her job might become very active with very little notice. Vore was standing at the navigation plot when I came in. The holographic display showed our position, a small blue indicator labeled asterisk in CS, surrounded by the passive intercept returns of every Varath system we had mapped in the past 6 days, patrol routes in pale amber, relay node positions in white. The border station at Varac Prime behind us, 41 hours travel at our current speed. Ahead, the Deep System Relay Hub at Keth 9, another 31 hours out. We were roughly in the center of the sealed corridor. "Sit down," Vore said without looking up. I sat at the spare terminal near the XO station. "I want to talk about the surface event," Vore said. She used that term, the surface event, rather than the decloak or the reveal, and I had noticed that she always did, and I had decided it was deliberate. Surface was the right word. We weren't going to appear from nowhere. We were going to become visible, which was a different thing. We had always been here. The question was when we told them. "You've been running intercept for 6 days, she said. "Tell me what you know about the Varath command response protocol when something anomalous enters their sensor picture." I told her what I knew. The Varath had a three-stage response doctrine for border anomalies. Stage 1. A patrol vessel is redirected to investigate any sensor return that doesn't match the registered traffic manifest. Stage 2. If the anomaly doesn't resolve within a defined time window, or if the patrol vessel's investigation confirms an unregistered contact, the patrol command, which was a Sedhari caste officer, not a Kethali, sends a formal notification to the nearest Kethali command station. Stage 3. The Kethali command station issues a response directive, which could be anything from a formal challenge to an engagement order to a request for identification. The time between Stage 1 and Stage 2 was typically 40 minutes, based on the traffic patterns I had observed. The time between Stage 2 and Stage 3 was harder to quantify, because it depended on Kethali command availability and on what the Sedhari notification actually said. In routine situations, a registry mismatch, an unauthorized transit, I had seen response times between 2 and 6 hours. For something that didn't fit any category in the existing registry, I didn't have good data. And if it's something the Kethali have no precedent for, Vor asked. Then I would expect the response time to be longer, I said. The Kethali don't delegate well. The higher the anomaly, the more levels of the hierarchy need to be involved, and each level communicates with the one above it through formal channels that have mandatory confirmation steps built in. If we give them something that requires Kethali high command, the upper Kethali tier, the ones who actually make policy, the bureaucratic latency could run to 12 hours or more. Vor looked at me. And if we gave them something that required not just an answer but a revision of doctrine? I thought about that. I don't know, I said. The doctrine revision process is a Kethali tier function. It requires consensus across a minimum of 7 senior Kethali, and those 7 are spread across at least 3 star systems. Minimum communication time between them, given their secure channel protocols, is approximately 4 hours per round. A full consensus on a doctrine revision could take days. Days during which they'd be sitting on a problem they couldn't answer. Yes. Vor nodded slowly, the way she did when she'd already thought through something and was checking whether her thinking held up against someone else's. Here's what I want from you during the surface event, she said. I want you monitoring every Varath frequency simultaneously. Primary, secondary, command, patrol, relay, encrypted if you can crack the current protocol. I want to know what they say in the first 2 minutes. I want to know what they say in the first 10. I want to know the order in which their communication chain activates and how far up the hierarchy the initial notification climbs before it either stalls or keeps moving. Can you do that? I said I could. Good, we surface at 1400 today. She said it the way she would have said we dock at 1400 today, or we take on supplies at 1400. She said it flat, without theater, and then she went back to the navigation plot and the briefing was over. I went back to my console. Those 6 hours were, I think, the strangest of the mission. The work was the same as it had been for the past 6 days, passive intercept, monitoring, logging, but the quality of the time was different. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been during the preceding days, of the specific weight of what was about to happen. Not afraid. The asterisk Crooked Silence was a warship, and she was capable of a great deal more than what we were planning, and Vor had given me no reason to doubt that whatever happened in the next few hours, we would be able to handle it. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the feeling of having written a long document, having submitted it, and waiting for the response, knowing that the response would confirm or refute the thing you had spent a great deal of time working out, and that the confirmation or refutation would be total and public and irreversible. I had spent 11 years on Varath analysis. I had spent 8 months writing a 412-page document arguing that the sealed corridor was permeable. In roughly 6 hours, I would find out whether I had been right. I was right about the gaps. I already knew that. 6 days of silence had confirmed it. But my document had also made a claim about what the Varath command hierarchy would do when confronted with evidence that their border doctrine was false. And that claim was based on inference and behavioral modeling, and 11 years of reading intercepted communications. And it was the part of the document I was least certain about. The part I had phrased most carefully. The part where I had said, in the language of formal analysis, given the structural dependence of the Varath hierarchy on the concept of inviolable sovereign space, a confirmed breach of doctrine, specifically, confirmed evidence that an unregistered vessel has traversed the sealed corridor without detection, will produce a command paralysis that makes a military response not impossible but sufficiently delayed and complicated to allow the visiting vessel to withdraw on its own terms, provided withdrawal is initiated within the paralysis window. Provided withdrawal is initiated within the paralysis window. I had calculated that window at between 4 and 12 hours, with a midpoint estimate of 7. It was the number I was least comfortable with in the entire document. It was the number that everything else depended on. At 13:55, I put on a second monitoring feed and configured my console to flag any Varath transmission on any frequency with a timestamp, a source location estimate, and an automatic routing to a priority queue. At 13:58, I ran a final check on all passive intercept systems. At 13:59, Urheel and Vanson came into the secondary ops center and took their stations without a word, because I had sent them a notification at 13:30 and they were professional enough to be there at the right time without being told twice. At 1400 exactly, the *In's crooked silence powered up every system she had. The sensation was physical. 6 days of silence and then, not loud exactly, because the ops center was well insulated from the engine spaces, but present. A vibration in the deck plating, a change in air pressure. The lights shifted from their minimum duty amber to the full working white of an active crew at stations. The holographic display in the primary ops center, I could see it on a secondary feed from my console, went from the pale ghost picture of our passive intercept to the full resolution active sensor picture, which on the * crooked silence was very large and very detailed and very specific. We were, in that moment, broadcasting our presence to every sensor system within a range that I will not specify for reasons that remain classified, but which I will describe as considerable. The first Varath response came in at 41 seconds after power-up. It was a patrol vessel, the same class I had been tracking for 2 days, running its standard sweep arc in our vicinity. Their sensor operator had clearly been watching a live feed because the response was fast, a sharp deviation from their established course heading, a spike in their own active sensor emissions, and an internal communication burst that my system flagged and began decrypting. The decryption on their current protocol took approximately 8 seconds. What I read when it came through was a patrol crew exchange that I have thought about many times since. The sensor operator said, in roughly equivalent Terran standard, unregistered contact, bearing coordinates, designation unknown, power signature exceeds registry maximum. The patrol commander said, exceeds registry maximum by what margin? The sensor operator said, it exceeds the registry maximum by a significant amount. There is no matching signature on record. The patrol commander said, are you certain it is not an instrument fault? The sensor operator said, I am certain. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, during which I imagined the patrol commander looking at the same return their sensor operator was looking at, and trying to find a frame for it that the existing doctrine could accommodate. I had done something similar once, when the first clean sensor gap data had come back from a survey probe, and I'd sat there for a moment trying to convince myself the instrument was malfunctioning, rather than that I had just discovered a significant hole in what everyone had been told was an impenetrable system. The patrol commander said, Log it and transmit to patrol control. Maintain current heading. Do not approach. I flagged that last instruction to a priority note. Do not approach. That was not standard anomaly protocol, which would have required an initial investigation pass. The commander had looked at the size of what was on their screen and made a decision that protocol did not explicitly sanction, but that common sense clearly justified. At 1 minute and 57 seconds after power-up, the first Varath patrol control transmission went out. It was a Stage 1 anomaly notification, directed to the nearest command relay at Keth 7. I captured it in full. The relevant portion read, "Unregistered contact in the Keth passage interior. Power signature and hull cross-section indicate capital class vessel. Designation unknown. No matching profile in the registry. Contact is active and holding position." At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, a second patrol vessel changed course. This one was further out, on the outer arc of the standard sweep pattern. Their communication was shorter. They had picked us up on their own sensors and were confirming the contact to the same patrol control. Then, a third vessel. Then, at just under 4 minutes after power-up, the border station at Keth 7, not Varath Prime, which was 41 hours behind us, but the inner relay station, transmitted its own acknowledgement to the patrol control notification and opened a formal inquiry channel to the next level of the command hierarchy. It was climbing. The question was how fast. At 14:15, Captain Vor's voice came over my personal comm. "Duvet, status." I told her what I had. 3 patrol vessels that had confirmed our presence and were holding position at respectful distance. The Keth 7 relay station had forwarded a Stage 1 notification up the chain. No engagement posture from any vessel I had on scope. No weapons locks, and at our current active sensor resolution, I would have seen a weapons lock from a patrol-class vessel at this range as clearly as a lit match in a dark room. "Any indication of a Stage 2 notification?" Vor asked. "Not yet. Keth 7 is the current holding point. They'll be waiting for the Sedhari duty officer to confirm receipt before forwarding." Time estimate for that confirmation: between 20 and 40 minutes, based on their standard bureaucratic cadence. "Good. Maintain intercept. I want to know the moment a Sedhari tier officer puts their name on a notification." At 14:31, the Sedhari duty officer at the Keth 7 relay confirmed the anomaly notification and forwarded it 1 level up. Their confirmation message contained a phrase that I marked in my intercept log with 2 stars, which was my notation for something that seemed significant and warranted review. The Sedhari officer's transmission said, "In equivalent Terran standard, this contact is inconsistent with current doctrine parameters, and I am forwarding with a request for Kethali tier review." Inconsistent with current doctrine parameters. I had been inside their space for 6 days. They had just been told about me 41 seconds ago. They didn't know how long I'd been there yet. They were about to find out. At 14:38, Captain Vor broadcast the *crooked silence *S mission log on a tight beam transmission directed at the Keth 7 relay, using the Varath standard communication protocol. The transmission was clear, unencrypted, and structured precisely the way a Varath official notification would be structured. Because Vor had tasked their signals chief, a senior operator named Kassan Orr, with building a transmission template that followed Varath communication conventions exactly, because Vor had been thinking about this moment for a long time, and she understood that the message wasn't just the content, it was the form. The content of the transmission was this: a timestamp position log showing the track of the INS Crooked Silence from the moment of threshold crossing to the moment of surface event. The log was compressed into a data package that, when opened, displayed a moving line plot of our 6-day transit. Through the threshold at the first identified sensor gap, deep into the Keth Passage interior along a route that threaded through patrol corridors and relay node coverage zones, 43 kilometers from a patrol vessel on day 4, through the interior of Keth 7's own sensor range without registration. 6 days. We had been inside their border for 6 days, and they had not seen us. The log was accompanied by a single-line text notification. This is the mission record of the Terran stealth cruiser INS Crooked Silence. Transit duration inside Varath sovereign space, 6 standard days. Attachment, complete navigational record. We are prepared to withdraw on mutual acknowledgement. I watched my intercept feeds. The first response to the transmission came from a Varath signals operator at Keth 7, and it was not a formal notification. It was an internal message to a colleague at the same station. The decryption took 12 seconds. The message said, "Did you receive the Terran transmission?" The colleague said, "Yes." There was a pause. Then the first operator said, "The log, did you look at the log?" The colleague said, "Yes." Another pause longer. Then the first operator said nothing else. I did not quote that exchange in any official report, but I've thought about it often. The formal Varath response to the transmission came 15 minutes later, and it did not come from Keth 7. It came from a command tier station 2 relay nodes further up the chain, which meant that the Sedhari officer who had forwarded the anomaly notification had not waited for his standard escalation cycle to run. He had seen the mission log and moved immediately. The formal response was addressed to the INS Crooked Silence using our hull designation, which they had pulled from the transmission's header data, and it read, "Your transmission has been received. We are processing. You are requested to hold current position, pending Kethali review. You are requested to hold current position." Not ordered, not commanded, requested. I flagged that word and sent it to Captain Vor with a note that said, "I believe the Sedhari officer recognized that they were not in a position to give an order that they could enforce, and chose language accordingly." Vor's response 2 minutes later agreed, "Continue monitoring, I'm watching the clock." What I watched over the next 90 minutes was the Varath command hierarchy, attempting to process a fact that none of its existing protocols were designed to accommodate. I watched because I had the intercept feeds, and because it was my job, but I also watched because I had been analyzing this civilization for 11 years, and I had never expected to see their internal deliberations in real time at exactly the moment their foundational doctrine was coming apart. The Sedhari tier forwarded the mission log to the Kethali command station at Varath Prime, the same border station we had passed 41 hours behind us, whose active sensor range we had spent considerable effort to remain outside of during our insertion. The Kethali command station at Varath Prime received the log at 15:03, 65 minutes after our power-up, which was fast for the hierarchy's standard communication latency. Fast meant they were moving it up without waiting for the normal confirmation cycles. Fast meant they understood what they were looking at. At 15:11, the Kethali command station at Varath Prime issued a signal to all patrol vessels in the Keth Passage: maintain current dispositions. Do not engage. Do not approach the unregistered contact. Do not engage. I want to be precise about something. The asterisk Crooked Silence was not defenseless, but she was also not a warship in the full sense of a ship built for combat. She was built for penetration and observation. In a direct engagement with a serious Varath military force, the outcome would have been uncertain. The decision to surface had not been made on the assumption that we could fight our way out if it came to that. It had been made on the assumption that it wouldn't come to that. And that assumption was the thing I had either gotten right or catastrophically wrong, and the distinction between those two outcomes had always been the part of the plan that wasn't engineering. Do not engage. I read those 3 words, and I felt something that I cannot quite describe as relief, and cannot quite describe as satisfaction, because neither of those words captures the specific quality of having a prediction confirmed at the moment of maximum stakes. It was more like the sensation of watching a proof complete itself. The recognition that the logic had held, that the model had been correct, that the 11 years of reading and the 8 months of writing and the 412 pages had produced an accurate description of something real. The logic had been this. The Varath command doctrine placed absolute decision authority over military engagement in Cathali tier hands. The Sedhari could not authorize an engagement. The local Cathali command station, a Cathali tier 3 node, in my classification, could authorize a defensive engagement in response to a direct attack, but could not authorize an offensive engagement against a vessel that was holding position, broadcasting in their own communication format, and explicitly stating its willingness to withdraw. An offensive engagement required consensus from a minimum of 3 Cathali Tier 2 nodes, which were the senior command stations, and those nodes were distributed across 3 star systems, and the communication latency between them was not trivial. More importantly, an offensive engagement would require the Cathali to put their names on the authorization, to issue an order formally under their own designation codes, in response to a situation that the mission log had already made undeniable. They would have to authorize force against a vessel that had, by any reading of the mission log, already demonstrated the obsolescence of the doctrine they were fighting to defend. And the record of that authorization would exist. It would be in their own communication archives, and in ours, and it would say, "We ordered this engagement knowing that our border doctrine had already failed." The Cathali did not want to put their names on that. This was the inference. This was the claim in my document that I had been least certain about, and it was holding. At 1547, the Cathali command station at Varath Prime transmitted a formal query to the next tier up, a Tier 2 Cathali node, one of the 3 that would be required for an offensive engagement authorization. The query was encrypted with a protocol I couldn't crack in real time, but I could read the transmission's header metadata, and the header told me the message priority, and the priority code was not the emergency engagement flag. It was the policy review flag. They weren't asking for permission to fire. They were asking for doctrine guidance. I sent Vor a message that said, "They've kicked it to policy review. I assess we are past the window for a rapid engagement authorization. My recommendation, we can begin withdrawal within the hour." Vor's response came back in 4 minutes. "I agree. Stand by." At 16:03, Captain Senavor broadcast a second transmission on the Varath Standard Communication Protocol. It was addressed to the Cathali command station at Varath Prime, and it read, "This is the INS Crooked Silence. We have held position as requested. We are now initiating withdrawal from Varath Sovereign Space via the same transit corridor used in our approach. Our navigational track will be broadcast in real time on this frequency throughout the withdrawal. We expect no interference. We wish the Varath Dominion no harm, and we consider this transit concluded." We were moving before the transmission finished encoding. The withdrawal was the inverse of the insertion. Minimum tactical speed, passive systems supplemented by the active sensor picture we now had no reason to suppress, threading back through the transit corridor on essentially the same route we had used coming in. The difference was that this time, every Varath system in the Keth passage knew we were here, and we were broadcasting our track in real time as Vor had promised, and they were watching. I watched them watch us. The patrol vessels I had been monitoring for 6 days held their positions. A few adjusted their headings, marginally, in ways that could have been interpreted as positioning for observation rather than interception. The relay stations tracked our emissions as we passed. The communication traffic was substantial. I was capturing more Varath transmissions per minute than I had collected in any equivalent period during the entire 6-day insertion. The traffic was still climbing the hierarchy. The policy review flag was still attached to the most recent command traffic going up. Nothing was coming back down that looked like an engagement order. We were 3 hours and 20 minutes into the withdrawal when we cleared what I had designated as the threshold, crossing back into unclaimed space on a heading toward the Survey Directorate's outer network. I should tell you what those 3 hours and 20 minutes looked like from my console, because they were different from anything else in the mission. During the insertion, we had been invisible and silent, and the Varath had been the only ones doing anything that mattered. During the surface event, we had been at the center of a storm of escalating Varath communication traffic, and the work had been the work of rapid triage, flagging, decrypting, routing, assessing, reporting to Vor. But during the withdrawal, we were visible to every Varath system in the Keth Passage, moving at moderate speed on a published track, and the Varath knew exactly where we were and exactly where we were going, and they did not move to intercept us, and what I had to do was watch that not happen. It is harder to watch something not happen than it sounds. Every course adjustment by a patrol vessel in our vicinity required a decision. Is this a positioning move, or the beginning of an intercept? Every change in comm traffic volume required assessment. Is this escalation, or normal operational chatter? Every encrypted burst from the Kethali command station at Verac Prime required a judgment call about what the communication protocol metadata could tell me about its content before the decryption finished. Vor was patient with my updates. She asked for a status report every 20 minutes and I gave her one, and in each report the relevant information was essentially the same. The patrol vessels are holding, the engagement traffic is not there, the hierarchy is still in review mode. But every report required reconfirming that, because the alternative, that I had missed the engagement traffic, that I had misread a course adjustment, was not a small alternative. I confirmed it each time, the evidence held. When we crossed the threshold, Vor came over the ship-wide channel. Not to the crew, not to me specifically, ship-wide so everyone heard it. She said, "We are clear of Varath sovereign space. 6-day transit complete. All stations stand down from silent running. Good work." That was all. I sat at my console for another hour, monitoring the Varath traffic as it thinned and quieted. The communication chain was still active. The policy review query was presumably still moving up through the Kethali tier structure and would continue moving up for some time. The patrol vessels in the Keth Passage had resumed something resembling their standard sweep patterns, though with a density that was notably higher than their pre-event cadence. The relay station at Keth 7 had gone to an elevated transmission rate that I interpreted as a significantly increased reporting burden. At some point in the next several days, the Kethali High Command would receive a formal advisory that their sovereign border had been penetrated by a Terran vessel, that the vessel had transited the sealed corridor for 6 days without detection, and that the vessel had withdrawn without incident after broadcasting a full mission log. The advisory would come with a recommendation. I didn't know what the recommendation would say, but I had my inferences. It would probably say something about sensor grid upgrades, patrol density increases, and a formal diplomatic inquiry to the Terran government. It would probably not say what the actual problem was. The actual problem was not the sensor gaps. I had said in my document that the gaps could be fixed, though fixing them would require infrastructure investment that the Varath were, based on their maintenance cycle history, unlikely to prioritize. The actual problem was the doctrine. The doctrine said the border was inviolable. The doctrine had said that for 60 years. The doctrine was the foundation of the Kethali's claim to authority over everything that moved within Varath space. And the doctrine was now, on the record, demonstrably false. You can patch a sensor gap. You can add patrol vessels and shrink the coverage windows. You can upgrade your encryption protocols and reduce the latency in your command chain. What you cannot do, once the record exists, is make it not exist. The Crooked Silence *S mission log was already in the Terran Survey Directorate's archives. The Varath had a copy because Vor had transmitted it to them. The patrol crew that had said "do not approach" instead of initiating an investigation pass had, in the long view of things, made exactly the right call. But their record of making that call would sit in the Kethali archives alongside the mission log, and anyone reading both documents together would understand why they had made it. The Varath could rebuild their sensor infrastructure. They could tighten their patrols. They could issue new doctrine saying the border was doubly inviolable, triply sealed. None of that would change what the record said. The record said, a Terran vessel entered Varath sovereign space, remained there for 6 standard days, broadcast its position and track upon departure, and withdrew on its own terms while the entire Varath command hierarchy processed what had happened. No shots fired. No engagement. Not because neither side was capable, because the Kethali had understood at the moment of maximum pressure that the fight they could have chosen to start was not the fight they could afford to finish, and not because of what the crooked silence might have done to them, but because of what they would have had to admit on the record to themselves. Their border had been permeable for 11 years, and they hadn't known it. Their border had been permeable for 6 days with a Terran crew inside it, watching their patrol cycles, listening to their routine traffic, mapping their relay infrastructure, and they hadn't known it. The walls they had built their authority on were real in every sense that mattered to the lower castes. The Sedhari and the enforcement tier officers who ran the border and who believed, because they had been told to believe, and because they had no evidence to the contrary, that the Kethali's claim of inviolability was a technical fact and not a cultural one. The Kethali had known, at some level, the way all hierarchies know, at some level, that their authority is a maintained agreement and not a force of nature. But knowing abstractly is different from having the evidence put formally on the record by someone else. I thought about the Sedhari duty officer at Keth 7 who had forwarded the anomaly notification with the note. This contact is inconsistent with current doctrine parameters, and I am forwarding with a request for Kethali tier review. That officer had been doing their job exactly as trained. They had received information that didn't fit the doctrine and had passed it upward as required. They had not panicked. They had not acted independently. They had been a perfect instrument of the hierarchy's protocols. And in being a perfect instrument, they had handed the Kethali a problem that the Kethali's own doctrine had no mechanism to resolve. You cannot run a policy review fast enough to contain a fact that is already in the record. You cannot ask the lower castes to continue believing in the inviolability of a border that a Terran ship just spent 6 days inside of, because the lower castes are now, at this moment, reading the mission log that we broadcast to them on their own communication frequencies, and they are asking each other what this means, and the Kethali do not yet have an answer. Doctrine collapse, that was what I had predicted, not a defeat, not a battle, not a negotiation. A collapse, the particular kind of failure that happens not when a wall is broken, but when it becomes undeniable that the wall was never as solid as everyone agreed to believe. The Varath would adapt. I said that in my debrief report, and I meant it. They were not a weak civilization. They were not incapable of revising their doctrine, rebuilding their infrastructure, or recalibrating their hierarchy's internal authority claims. What they had lost was not the capacity to defend their space. What they had lost was the 60-year-old certainty that they did not need to. And that loss would propagate through the caste structure in ways that I could model and predict, but which ultimately mattered less to me, sitting in the secondary ops center of the crooked silence as we ran toward Outer Reach Station, than the simple fact that we had gone in and come out and the record existed and could not be unmade. I wrote a final note in my mission log before I handed it over for archival. 6 days inside a sealed border, 0 shots fired, full withdrawal on our own terms. The assessment of the document stands. The border was permeable. Urhil beside me was still turning his stylus. Vanson, on my left, was running her standard post-operation passive intercept review with the same focused quiet she brought to everything. I powered down my active monitoring feeds. There was nothing left in Varath space that required real-time attention, and sat for a while with nothing in particular on my screen. I thought about the Kethali Tier 2 node that was, at that moment, receiving the policy review query from Varath Prime and beginning to compose a response that would need to navigate the distance between what the doctrine said and what the record showed. And I thought about how long that composing would take and what it would feel like to be the Kethali officer who had to start writing. I thought about walls, not in a philosophical sense. I am not given to philosophy as a professional habit, but in a practical one. A wall that has been physically breached can be repaired. A wall whose impermanence has been formally established and distributed to the people on both sides of it is a different kind of problem. You can rebuild the physical structure. You cannot rebuild the prior assumption that it had never been tested. We had tested the assumption. We had tested it for 6 days in silence from the inside. There was a word for what the Varath border had turned out to be. Not broken, not destroyed. Just what it had always been, in fact, stripped now of the 60 years of formal consensus that had made it seem like something else. Permeable. The asterisk inn's crooked silence ran toward Outer Reach Station at standard transit speed, her hull no longer asymmetric against the dark, because there was nothing left to hide from, her active sensors painting the full picture of clear space ahead. And behind us, at Keth 7 and Varath Prime, and in the transmission queues of 3 Tier 2 Kethali command nodes, the record of what we had done was moving up a hierarchy that had no category for it, looking for a place to land. It would find one eventually, everything does. But it would never stop being what it was.